Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. On the morning of February 19th, 1996, the surgical schedule at Bethesda North Medical Center in Cincinnati had a glaring hole. One of the country's top cardiothoracic surgeons, Dr. Darryl Sutorius, simply didn't show up. No calls, no delays, no messages. In a profession where minutes can decide lives, that silence was deafening. A colleague placed a call to local law enforcement, requesting a welfare check at his home in Simms Township, Hamilton County, Ohio. The house on Simms Ridge Lane was still, the kind of quiet you can feel. Deputies made entry. The air inside was cold but heavy, and the basement lights were dim. On a couch sat Dr. Sutorius, motionless, a .38 caliber revolver lying within inches of his hand. To an untrained eye, it looked like a self-inflicted gunshot wound, a clear suicide. But the officers on scene were trained to read more than just the surface. The first notation in the incident log was brief but telling. Position inconsistent, secure and hold for further assessment. The scene was preserved under Hamilton County protocol. No items were moved until photographs and video sweeps were complete. Every inch of the basement was measured and documented. Couch height, distance from weapon to hand, angle from barrel to entry wound. Spatter patterns were logged, not interpreted. That would come later in the lab. Rigor mortis was present, and lividity had set in, indicating several hours since death. The initial time of death estimate did not perfectly match the last known sighting, creating the first procedural hold in the chain of assumptions. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms. Upstairs was orderly, kitchen appliances off, coffee maker clean, mail stacked on the counter, no immediate signs of a struggle in the main living areas. Downstairs, aside from the body and the weapon, the environment appeared controlled. It was precisely the kind of scene that can mislead. Everything seemingly in place, except for the fact that someone was dead. For investigators, suicide was still a working theory, but not the only one. Hamilton County detectives initiated parallel lines of inquiry. One team securing the firearm and beginning chain of custody procedures, another canvassing neighbors for last heard or last seen times. The revolver, a .38 Special, was unloaded carefully, each round placed in separate evidence envelopes. Latent prints were dusted on the grip, trigger guard, and cylinder release. The medical examiner's office was notified, and transport was arranged under seal. Within hours, the autopsy slot was scheduled. The goal: determine if the wound trajectory, gunpowder residue, and stippling patterns were consistent with self-infliction at close range. Detectives knew that in firearms deaths, what the weapon says is one part. What the body says can be something else entirely. From the start, one procedural question loomed. Why would a surgeon with decades of precision in his hands, known for exacting technique, leave behind a scene with physical inconsistencies? Detectives kept that thought off the record for now, but it was there. In towns like Simms Township, a violent death inside a home is more than a crime scene. It's a disruption to the unspoken agreement that your own four walls keep danger out. And here, the question was as stark as it was simple. Was this the end of a man's life by his own decision, or was someone else in that basement before the deputies arrived? The basement is the only room that matters. If this was a suicide, the geometry and the clock must agree. If it was not, the same geometry and the same clock will disagree, loudly. Detectives worked the scene in two clean lanes, a self-inflicted death model and a homicide model. Nothing speculative, no shortcuts. They photographed, diagrammed, and measured before a single conclusion appeared in the notes. Couch height, seat depth, cushion compression beneath the body, distance from the revolver's grip to the closest resting point of the victim's hand. Each number was logged beside a timestamp and an evidence tag. The house remained sealed while the medical examiner scheduled the autopsy and the lab cued the firearm for test firing. No one called this a suicide. No one called it a murder. The file said undetermined, and that word controlled the pace. Trajectory is a starting point. Investigators placed a rod through the entrance wound path as documented at scene, then projected it across the couch and into the room. The line intersected upholstery at a height and angle inconsistent with a seated, arm-extended, self-inflicted shot from the position in which the body was found. They noted a separate defect in the furniture, a small circular tear with underlying substrate damage, consistent with a second projectile path. The inventory didn't claim 2 shots yet. It recorded additional penetration, marked with a separate placard, photographed with a scale, and assigned its own tag number. Reach matters. They measured forearm length, shoulder flexion range, and plausible wrist angles a right-handed shooter could achieve while seated or reclined at that couch. They compared that envelope to the recorded muzzle-to-target line. The numbers didn't automatically exclude suicide, but they didn't confirm it either. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When the simplest story is forced to fit, scale marks often tell on the storyteller. Bloodstain documentation stayed descriptive. Analysts mapped projected spatter on the wall section behind the couch and on limited portions of the cushion. Directionality vectors suggested a source at head level near the upper cushion seam, but voids and a sharp termination line along the armrest complicated any quick call. The report did not interpret, it preserved. That restraint is standard. Pattern analysis becomes opinion only after lab correlation and autopsy detail on wound characteristics and muzzle distance. Time of death is its own test. The coroner's investigator documented body temperature, rigidity, and fixed lividity with photographs of dependent areas. The preliminary window suggested death occurred hours before the deputies arrived, earlier than the last expected communication from the victim's routine. That gap pushed canvassers back out to neighbors and colleagues to lock down last seen and last heard times. A missing phone call, a car that didn't move, porch lights that stayed off. Small observations can correct a timeline by hours. In a medical professional's life, a 2-hour shift can be the difference between a normal night and a red flag. Weapon placement and condition were treated as a separate issue. The .38 lay within inches of the victim's hand, cylinder closed. The hammer position and index of the cartridge under the firing pin were recorded, along with the presence or absence of blood or tissue on the grip, trigger, and exterior surfaces. Prints, if any, would be a lab job. Powder residue testing was logged but not interpreted on scene. Those kits would go to the lab with the clothing and the victim's sampled hands. Every reference to residue in the field notes used conditional language: collected, sealed, submitted. No one wrote positive or negative on a clipboard in a basement. The upstairs rooms were photographed to confirm what they had already appeared to be: orderly and undisturbed. No forced entry points, no rummaged drawers, mail stacked neatly. That calm domestic picture isn't proof of anything by itself. It is, however, a condition that shapes hypotheses. If no outsider pushed into this house, investigators have to consider whether the scene was prepared after the fact or if the death was self-inflicted in a controlled environment. That's not drama, that's scope control. The schedule mattered too. Hospital staff provided the on-call calendar and the precise time the surgeon missed rounds. The tone from colleagues was professional, not speculative. He had never simply failed to appear. The absence created a precise anchor for when concern started and when the welfare check was requested. In suburbs like this, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Here, the tear began as a hole in a morning schedule. By day's end, detectives had 2 working models and a list of tests that could break the tie. Autopsy findings on entrance characteristics and soot or stippling. Lab confirmation of muzzle to target distance. Confirmation that the second furniture defect was ballistic. Residue analysis from hands and clothing. And any trace evidence on the weapon inconsistent with a self-inflicted event. They also flagged the need to secure purchase records and training logs for the exact model of revolver, plus medical and personal documentation that could explain or contradict a suicide hypothesis. That documentation would be developed later. Today belonged to the room. One more note went into the file before the scene was released. The firearm's proximity to the hand was photographed from multiple angles with a ruler at the same height as the grip. Perspective can lie. Scale does not. That small practice prevents later confusion when a single still photo is misread as proof of reach. The case would need more than photos to make a final call, but the photos would keep the measurements honest. This chapter is not about naming anyone. It's about whether a single quiet basement can carry 2 stories at once. Right now it can't. The angle, the extra defect in the couch, the time of death window, and the neutral, undisturbed upstairs all resist the simplest label. The investigation will move with that resistance, not against it. When a room raises questions, the next step isn't speculation, it's paperwork. Detectives shifted from tape measures to document requests, employer files, insurance designations, banking activity, property records, and any civil filings that could show where the marriage stood and where the money would go if a spouse died. Rooms speak in physics, paper speaks in intent. The employer response came first. From Bethesda North, investigators sought confirmation of beneficiary designations tied to the surgeon's salary, pension, and any life insurance policies offered through the hospital network. They also requested recent communications from the benefits office, letters, forms mailed, or internal notes indicating pending changes. The ask was routine but targeted. Establish whether the victim had initiated steps to remove his spouse from financial benefits prior to death. In parallel, the team served subpoenas for any privately held life insurance policies and investment accounts. If divorce was on the table, paperwork usually moved before people talked about it out loud. Interview teams handled the relationship timeline with restraint and structure. Colleagues and family were asked to confine answers to dates, documents, and direct observations rather than opinions. Multiple sources confirmed the couple met through a dating service in late 1994 and married in 1995. By early 1996, the picture that emerged was a marriage under strain. Investigators did not label anyone responsible. They marked simple, traceable facts, separate social routines, conversations about ending the relationship, and steps toward formal separation. Each note in the file was kept tethered to a document request. No narrative without an anchor. Financial records filled in the gaps. Bank subpoenas returned account openings, additions of a spouse as joint holder, and later discussions at the branch level about changing access. Monthly statements flagged large line items routinely associated with professional households, mortgage, utilities, insurance premiums, with no obvious signs of frantic spending in the period immediately before the death. That calm snapshot didn't answer the big question, but it mattered. Investigators weren't seeing a last-minute financial crisis. They were seeing a household set to be reorganized by divorce, which in turn would change who received what. Civil paperwork often telegraphs the end of a marriage before friends accept it. Investigators sought any indication of filed or drafted divorce documents, correspondence with counsel, or consultations scheduled on the surgeon's calendar. The aim wasn't to build character stories. It was to document a pivot from together to separate. Once those records are in hand, motive, if there is one, isn't something a narrator asserts. It's what jurors later read in black and white. Insurance files added weight. The combined value of employer-provided benefits and private policies could reach a figure that prosecutors would later cite, approaching the high six figures to roughly $900,000 depending on elections and survivorship. That number, as a raw calculation, doesn't prove homicide. It does, however, define what death would do financially compared to divorce. The difference is the core of a financial motive theory if the physical evidence eventually points away from suicide. Detectives documented the delta and moved on. Analysis of why would come later, in court, not in a basement or an interview room. A clean step in the timeline was the most useful. The hospital schedule showed when the victim missed rounds. Phone logs and pager records, once obtained under warrant, could confirm when he last returned a call or received a page. Investigators asked the employer's telecom vendor for inbound-outbound logs that would legally qualify as business records. If communication stopped at a precise point, it helps narrow the window for time of death and cross-checks the preliminary estimate from the coroner's investigator. These logs do not name a killer. They draw the edges of the box in which the death occurred. Identity documentation was straightforward. The spouse was known socially as Dante, legal name Della Sutorius. Prior marriage histories and past allegations, if any, were handled by the book. Gather certified copies, log them under separate tabs, and let admissibility be decided by the court later. The point here wasn't to paint personality. It was to capture context that prosecutors might argue goes to motive or intent, subject to rules of evidence. On camera or on a microphone, the responsible move is to treat those past materials as potential, not proof. Property records for the Simmies Township home were pulled from county files. Deed history, loan documents, and any recent filings were reviewed to see whether ownership or survivorship clauses created immediate transfers upon death. If the house would automatically shift to a surviving spouse, that fact joins the insurance and pension numbers in the death versus divorce ledger. A single asset can't decide a case. A ledger of assets and benefits can explain why someone might benefit from a particular outcome. That is motive theory, distinct from the separate physical question of what happened in the basement. Investigators also checked for instruments commonly used in mid-career estates: updated wills, living trusts, durable powers of attorney, and healthcare proxies. In many households, those documents sit unchanged for years. In marriages under pressure, they start to move. Names come off, new trustees are named, terms are softened or tightened. Detectives noted whether counsel names appeared in the victim's appointment records and whether draft revisions existed. The difference between planned change and completed change can be crucial. If a victim died days before a change was executed, the old beneficiary often still controls the assets. Again, that doesn't prove homicide. It structures a theory the state may present if forensics later support one. The narrative of Chapter 3 is not accusation, it's an inventory. The prosecutor's office would later argue that the financial picture in early 1996 created pressure points, beneficiary changes in motion, a marriage headed toward dissolution, and substantial benefits that would pay only if the victim didn't live to complete those changes. Detectives built the record to allow that argument to be tested in daylight. They also built it to allow a defense to say the opposite, that money alone explains nothing without physical proof. Both lanes remained open because the autopsy and laboratory results had not yet arrived. When the document sweep ended for the week, the case file looked different than it had on day one. It no longer relied on impressions from a quiet basement. It carried letters, designations, forms, and schedules that marked a household in transition. If the room downstairs would eventually tell investigators how the death occurred, these papers would tell them what the death would change. Intent lives on paper more reliably than it does in rumor. A short note from a senior detective closed the day's entry. No conclusions. Hold pending me report, ballistic confirmation of furniture defect, residue analysis, and verification of benefit change status. That's how you keep a case coherent. You let independent pillars stand side by side until they either support the same structure or they don't. By early 1996, the marriage between Dr. Darryl Sutorius and Della Black Widow Sutorius had reached a critical breaking point. Investigators later reconstructed this period using a combination of witness statements, financial records, and phone logs. Friends and colleagues of Darryl described a man who had grown unusually guarded. He confided to a select few that he was considering ending the marriage. His concerns were not only personal but financial. Credit card charges in his name had escalated sharply, and withdrawals from joint accounts were unaccounted for. Police records indicate that Darryl began making discreet inquiries about divorce attorneys. The couple's home in the upscale Simmies Township area of Cincinnati appeared calm from the outside, but several neighbors reported hearing heated arguments through the winter months. None of these disputes resulted in police calls at the time, a fact investigators would later find notable, suggesting Darryl may have been reluctant to bring law enforcement into his private affairs. During this same period, Della maintained an outward image of control. She continued to attend social events, spoke confidently about her marriage, and avoided giving any indication to outsiders that tensions had reached a dangerous level. But forensic analysis of her phone records later showed frequent contact with individuals from her past, some of whom had known her during previous marriages. Several of these calls coincided with key dates when financial disputes were documented between her and Darryl. By February, Darryl's behavior had shifted in ways that his inner circle recognized immediately. He became less visible in his cardiology practice, postponed several elective procedures, and took extended lunch breaks away from the hospital. His secretary recalled one occasion where he received an unmarked envelope at work. The contents were never disclosed, but witnesses described him as visibly shaken afterward. This moment would later be revisited by prosecutors as a possible trigger point. At the same time, Della's access to firearms, specifically a .38 caliber revolver registered in her name, became a point of interest. The weapon had been purchased months earlier under the pretense of personal protection. According to firearms purchase records, she completed the mandatory background check without issue. Friends recalled her making casual remarks about always being able to defend herself, though none reported hearing any direct threats toward Darryl. Still, when placed against the broader backdrop of their deteriorating marriage, these facts became increasingly significant to investigators. Financially, the strain was mounting. Bank statements from January and February revealed substantial cash withdrawals in even denominations, amounts that prosecutors later argued were structured to avoid drawing bank scrutiny. Darryl's attempts to discuss these discrepancies reportedly led to more arguments, some of which were heard by household staff. The final documented sign of marital collapse came just days before Darryl's death. He canceled a planned trip with Della, telling friends he needed space to think. He also scheduled a private meeting with his attorney, a meeting that would never occur. Those who spoke to him in his last week described a man both decisive and uneasy, clear about ending the marriage, but perhaps aware of the risks in doing so. The search warrants executed on the Sutorius residence in the days following Dr. Darryl Sutorius's death produced a consistent trail of evidence. The crime scene unit began with a systematic sweep of the master bedroom where Darryl's body had been found. The ballistic team recovered a single .25 caliber shell casing lodged near the baseboard, partially obscured by the leg of a nightstand. The projectile itself was later removed from the victim's thoracic cavity during autopsy and matched to the casing through rifling characteristics. The weapon, a small caliber semi-automatic pistol, was located in a dresser drawer in the adjoining room. Initial swab tests revealed partial latent prints, smudged but sufficient to indicate recent handling. Gunshot residue testing on Della Sutorius's hands yielded positive results for barium and antimony, consistent with firing a handgun within hours of collection. Digital forensics added weight to the physical findings. Subpoenaed phone records showed outgoing calls from Della's personal line to multiple acquaintances in the hours after Darryl's estimated time of death. Several of these calls, according to witness statements, contained vague but urgent references to Darryl being gone or out of her life. Investigators noted the absence of any 911 call from the residence, despite the timeline suggesting Darryl had been shot well before discovery. The autopsy, performed by the Hamilton County coroner, documented a single gunshot wound to the head at close range. Stippling and soot patterns around the entry wound indicated the muzzle was within inches of the victim at the time of discharge. Toxicology tests revealed no sedatives or intoxicants, ruling out incapacitation prior to the shooting. Witness interviews began to outline the couple's final weeks. Colleagues and neighbors described rising tensions. Darryl had reportedly discussed seeking a divorce, citing both financial strain and concerns over Della's past behavior. Those past behaviors, uncovered during background checks, included a history of volatile relationships and prior restraining orders filed by former partners. Financial records subpoenaed from local banks showed that in the month before Darryl's death, Della had attempted to gain access to several of his accounts, including an investment portfolio and life insurance policies. One policy listed her as the sole beneficiary, with a payout exceeding $500,000. The timeline investigators reconstructed placed Darryl at home on the afternoon before his body was found. No signs of forced entry were present, and the alarm system had been disarmed using the household code. Only Della and Darryl were known to have that code. The prosecution would later argue that this point, combined with the forensic match between the recovered bullet and the firearm in Della's possession, closed the opportunity gap. By the end of this phase, law enforcement had compiled a cohesive chain of evidence, ballistics, residue tests, witness accounts, and financial motives that moved the case from a suspicious death to a prosecutable homicide. What remained was to confront Della directly, a process that would test the consistency of her statements against the weight of the physical evidence. Courtrooms don't decide what happened first. They decide what evidence is reliable enough for 12 citizens to consider. In the spring of 1996, before a single juror was sworn in, the Sutorius case moved from detectives' reports to the judge's rulings. The question wasn't guilt. The question was scope. Pre-trial conferences began with the basics: chain of custody on every exhibit from the Simmies Township home, authentication of photographs from the basement couch, and the autopsy record. The defense challenged foundation where it could: who bagged which item when the envelopes were sealed, how they were transported, and whether the lab logged intake without gaps. The state's response was procedural. Tags matched logs, seals were intact, custody was continuous. In homicide, paperwork keeps evidence alive long enough to be believed. The most sensitive motions concerned background. Prosecutors sought permission to present selected testimony about the marriage's decline, the pending divorce path, and beneficiary changes in motion near the time of death. They also asked to call former partners in a limited way to explain context the state said was relevant to motive and planning. The defense objected under Ohio's character evidence rules, arguing that past relationships risked turning a trial about one death into a referendum on a person. The court split the difference. Narrowly tailored testimony could come in to explain motive or intent if tied to documents or conduct close in time to the death. General character smears would not. Hearsay issues followed. Statements attributed to Dr. Darryl Sutorius about plans to separate, to change beneficiaries, or to meet with counsel were evaluated under state-of-mind exceptions. The ruling was precise. Jurors could hear that he intended to take steps affecting the marriage and finances because intent, not truth of every detail, was the point. The court barred any third-hand stories that strayed beyond that purpose. Trials don't tell everything. They tell what rules permit. Forensics required their own foundation. The court evaluated the methodology behind gunshot residue testing and trajectory work from the basement scene. The judge accepted the science under Ohio's expert evidence rule with two conditions. 1. Foundation for collection had to be established. Who swabbed, when, with what kit. And 2. Experts had to confine opinions to what the data supported, avoiding overreach. On photographs, the court allowed a limited set of scene and autopsy images, cropped where necessary, with instructions to the jury about their purpose, to understand injuries and reconstruction, not to inflame. The firearm trace and range records were admitted through custodians, dealer logs, purchase forms, and any range sign-ins linked to the specific .38 revolver. The defense attacked relevance and argued that lawful purchase doesn't prove unlawful use. The court agreed in principle but allowed the records for the limited purpose of showing access and familiarity, leaving weight to the jury. On the two-shot reconstruction, fatal head wound on the couch and a secondary impact in furniture suggesting staging, the judge required the state's expert to lay each step, measured angles from the scene, damage consistent with a second projectile, and why a self-inflicted scenario didn't fit those numbers. No shortcuts, no, because I think so. Media access mattered in Hamilton County in 1996. The judge permitted cameras with boundaries. Jurors would be instructed to avoid coverage. Counsel were warned against trying the case in the hallway. A change of venue was requested and denied. Voir dire would probe pre-trial exposure instead. The court also set limits on labels. Black Widow might appear in headlines. It would not be used in front of the jury by lawyers or witnesses. Trials are for names, dates, and exhibits, not nicknames. On the drug count, the court kept the cocaine possession as a separate offense, but issued a limiting instruction. Jurors could consider it only for what it proved and not as evidence of a general bad character. The defense moved to sever the count entirely. The motion was denied with the caution that the state could not use the drug arrest as propensity evidence for homicide. That boundary would matter later when the case went to appeal. Any statements made by the defendant underwent the usual scrutiny, Miranda compliance and voluntariness. Where interviews followed proper warnings and were not the product of coercion, the court allowed them. Where foundation was thinner, the court warned the state that any inconsistency would draw an immediate objection and potential exclusion. The message was simple. If a piece of evidence could not stand on process, it would not stand in trial. By the close of motions, the trial's shape was clear. Jurors would hear about the single basement scene, the .38 revolver access and practice, the residue work if the foundation held, and the reconstruction supporting a staged appearance of suicide. They would see a curated set of photographs and documents establishing the financial and marital context, not a parade of unrelated stories. They would be barred from hearing rhetoric that sold newspapers but added nothing probative. The case that began in a quiet basement was now bounded by rules that would decide how that room speaks in court. By the time the case reached trial, The prosecution's narrative was fully formed and supported by physical, forensic, and testimonial evidence. They presented a timeline beginning with the couple's deteriorating marriage, highlighting Darryl's expressed intentions to divorce, and the defendant's prior financial and marital history. Central to their case was the ballistic evidence. The .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol recovered from the Sutorius residence was matched conclusively to the bullet that killed Dr. Sutorius. The firearm, registered to Della, bore no signs of forced entry or third-party handling. Forensic investigators detailed how the bullet's trajectory was consistent with a close-range shot from behind, aligning with the coroner's finding of a contact wound to the back of Darryl's head. Gunshot residue testing revealed particles on the cuffs of a sweater belonging to Della, collected from her bedroom hamper. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of GSR tests, citing possible contamination, but the prosecution countered with expert testimony on the chain of custody and control samples. The state also introduced Della's financial records showing substantial debts, multiple prior marriages ending in contentious financial disputes, and recent withdrawals from joint accounts in the weeks preceding Darryl's death. This pattern was framed as motive. The loss of financial stability following a divorce could have been catastrophic for her. Witness testimony added weight to the prosecution's theory. Friends and colleagues of Darryl recalled his growing unease, describing him as watchful and measuring his words in Della's presence. Several testified that he had confided fears for his safety. The prosecution argued these statements were not hearsay but indicative of his state of mind in the days leading up to the shooting. The defense sought to portray the death as either accidental or potentially the act of another party, raising the possibility of suicide early in proceedings. This angle failed under cross-examination. The medical examiner's detailed wound path analysis eliminated suicide as a viable scenario. Additionally, there was no evidence of forced entry, theft, or unknown fingerprints, undermining the suggestion of an intruder. The jury deliberated for just under 8 hours. On the final day, the courtroom was silent as the foreperson delivered the verdict: guilty of aggravated murder. The sentence, 23 years to life, reflected both the gravity of the crime and the absence of mitigating circumstances. Della's reaction was minimal. She showed little visible emotion as the judge pronounced the penalty. From an investigative standpoint, the Sutorius case underscored the weight that consistent forensic evidence, corroborated by credible witness statements, can carry in securing a conviction. The sequence from crime scene processing to trial presentation demonstrated a methodical approach, one in which each evidentiary point reinforced the others, leaving minimal room for reasonable doubt. Under the weight of the evidence, the trial against Darryl Sutorius moved quickly. Prosecutors presented a clear timeline. Darryl, a respected cardiologist, had been shot in the couple's home. The weapon was traced directly to Della, and financial records revealed her pattern of exploiting previous partners. Witnesses, friends, family, and investigators described her calculated behavior in the days following his death, including efforts to hide the body and manipulate the narrative. The defense attempted to frame the killing as an act of self-preservation, but the jury found the contradictions too great. Medical experts testified the shot was fired at close range, with no signs of a struggle. In 1996, Della was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to 23 years to life. She died in prison, never expressing remorse. The case left a lasting impact in Ohio, serving as a stark reminder that violence often hides behind polished facades. It reinforced the importance of vigilance, not just in law enforcement but in personal relationships, and underscored how calculated manipulation can escalate to irreversible harm. The courtroom's final judgment ensured that the truth, however dark, would not be buried with Darryl. Looking back on this case, I'm reminded how easy it is to ignore red flags when someone hides behind charm and appearances. If there's one lesson I'd pass on, it's this: protect your peace, trust your instincts, and never let fear or manipulation silence you. In your own life, what warning signs would you refuse to overlook? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you or made you think, please subscribe so you won't miss the next one.